Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Since this show is all about timely content, I'd like to talk about the Fall of Anakin Skywalker as presented in Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. The reason why, though, is because I think it has some much more universal ideas that are contained within it about how it is that people can transgress moral boundaries and do evil things. So, first to talk about the movie and then to draw the lessons. The Fall of Anakin Skywalker, as I've mentioned a few times, at least in interviews that I've done here, is, I think, much more realistic than it is believable. Because if you look at the general plan of how does Anakin Skywalker fall, he gets progressively closer and closer to the line. He toes the line in the original meaning of it, where it's T-O-E, as in to put your toes right up against the line but not go over. He's getting he's becoming friends with Emperor Palpatine, the Sith. He's getting more closer here. He's being pulled further away from the Jedi, who, with regard to the Fall of Anakin Skywalker, you still have the Jedi, the forces of good, the Sith, the forces of evil. Lucas kind of screws that up with much of the rest of the movies, but in terms of the Fall of Anakin Skywalker, you still have that. That basic dynamic. So I'm going to talk about the Jedi as if they're, purely dedicated to good, and the Sith as if they're purely dedicated to evil, because in this one respect, they were those basic archetypes. So, within the movie, you see him pulling away from the Jedi, getting closer to the Sith, but, there's Jedi and the Sith, and there's a line in between. He's coming up, but he's not crossing the line. And then what happens is he does several kind of in rapid succession morally ambiguous things, where he's really kind of on the line, sort of. And from some perspectives, it can look like he's over it. Then what happens is Emperor Palpatine goes and convinces Anakin that, in fact, he had already crossed the line. At which point, he then, thinking of himself as already a Sith, happily just walks right across the line and commits evil acts, like slaughtering innocent people. The morally ambiguous act, you may recall, is the part where he goes and, as Mace Windu discovers that Palpatine is a Sith, Mace Windu goes and is going to kill Palpatine, and Anakin puts up his lightsaber and stops the killing blow and defends Palpatine, and then tells him that no, you can't just kill him, he has to be brought before the Jedi Council or put on trial or some variation thereof. I forget exactly. Now, this was defensible as a Jedi action. Certainly he had, that is to say, Anakin did have some motivations. He was friends with Palpatine and so on, so he was putting everything in the most favorable towards Palpatine light possible, but still within a Jedi framework, just killing him was not the ideal action. This could easily have been murder rather than some just form of killing. And so, stopping Windu in that moment from doing this was defensible as a Jedi, that a Jedi shouldn't do this, the Jedi should do this the correct way with the Council, and so on, and so forth. However, once he stops him, Palpatine then fights him and kills Windu, and then he presents Anakin with the interpretation that Anakin helped to kill Windu. Now, really he didn't. Really all he did was he stopped Windu from killing Palpatine. But under this interpretation, Anakin kind of switched sides already. And actually, to help sort of sweeten the interpretation, Palpatine, I can't remember if he says or he suggests, it's been a lot of years since I watched the movie, but that everybody would see Anakin as having been on Palpatine's side, which is itself very, very insidious and very tricky, very devious. And so Anakin essentially gets convinced that he's already become a Sith, at which point doing Sith-like things is normal. So when he's given the assignment to go and slaughter the Jedi younglings, he just goes and kills them, because of course the most powerful Jedi you've got, you definitely want to assign him to killing the least powerful opponents. But I think really, though it was not very good storytelling, the idea there, at least the defense you could give of it, was to cement Anakin's being on the Sith, that at this point they were going to kill the Jedi anyway, so they didn't really need his prowess in battle. What he really wanted was to make sure Anakin was definitely devoted to him, so that by slaughtering a whole bunch of innocent children, he would definitely be cemented as on the Emperor's side and is not going to switch sides, at least not for many decades. So, that's as presented in the movie, and it's... Well, I wouldn't recommend watching the movie again, but, nonetheless, if for some reason you find yourself watching it, look out for those things, because This does follow a way that people are able to talk themselves into moral transgressions they had previously found unthinkable. A lot of the psychological point comes from if you've ever heard the phrase "it's better to be hanged a sheep than a lamb." If you haven't, it refers to in cases where you are going to be treated as if you did something, some transgression or broke some law. You might as well go and break it now, since you're going to pay the penalty anyway. You might as well get the benefit in addition to paying the penalty. Well, there's a closely related thing that once you have switched states, it doesn't really matter how far you go. So if you had been morally upright and now you're a grievous sinner, well, at that point, well, what does it really matter how many grievous sins you commit? To take the legal metaphor, you can only be, hanged once. So you see this, sometimes in movies, but, also sometimes in real life where you have, gangs will have executioners. Somebody's already killed somebody, might as well kill as many people as he wants because, in earlier days, back when there was, when you might be executed for it, because they can only execute you once. So, does it really matter how many people you murder at that point, given that if they catch you, they're going to hang you anyway? So, in some sense, every murder after that is free. There's a really good movie on the more moral, less legal side of it. There's a really good movie. Movie trailer. There's a really good moment from a movie trailer. I have a suspicion the movie wasn't very good because it had a stupid premise. It was Nicolas Cage had escaped from hell, or the character he was playing, obviously, escaped from hell in order to help his child or some stupid thing like this, and so Satan sent a demon after him to reclaim him. Yeah, it's a really stupid premise, so I doubt it was a good movie. But there was this really great line when one of the demons who finally caught up with this character said, "Satan's not happy with you," and then the Nicolas Cage's character replies, "What, is he not going to let me back into hell?" I'm sorry, I think was he not going to let me back in? Which was a great line because of the logical problem, and was premised on impossibility. So if you start off with a giant plot hole, it often does set you up for some fairly good lines. But anyhow, it does point to that same psychological issue of, well, if you're going to hell anyway, what does it matter how many sins you commit now? You're going to hate, things are as bad as they can get, so what? Now, I'm not saying that's theology, mind you, I'm saying that's a psychological state. Now, here's the thing. As with Anakin Skywalker, taking that psychological phenomenon, the way this allows people to commit moral transgressions when they start off morally upright is if they walk close to the line and then do something that's ambiguous, at some point they can decide that they've already crossed the line. At which point, that psychological thing of, well, at this point, I've already sinned, what does it matter how many more sins I commit, can kick in. And that enables them to very easily, at that point, do all sorts of things they never would have done before. And so, how did they get into this? It's because they, what's the thing that allowed them? It was that interpretation of something that was not, in fact, a grievous sin as having been a grievous sin in retrospect. And then that enables them to think of themselves as already having switched states and then discarding all the inhibitions from their previous state as, an upright person. And I'm not that sort of person. I don't shoplift. I don't lie under oath. I don't steal. I don't murder, whatever it is. It enables them to discard that before they actually do anything that really changes their state. And so that psychological trick makes it much, much, much easier for them to then go and actually switch their state into that of being a grievous sinner. You sometimes see this in, if you ever read descriptions of how people got into embezzling large amounts of money. I think this applied to the Enron case. I've read a few others. I forget actually if I read up the Enron. I think I did. I think this applies to Enron, but I'm not sure. Certainly it applies to other cases. Where, how did the people embezzle? Well, what they did at first was they did something where they moved money around that they probably shouldn't, but it was not in fact illegal. They weren't doing anything genuinely illegal. And they were going to, I'm sorry, it's not embezzlement, because I apologize, not embezzlement, although there's something similar for embezzlement, where you can do things with expenses. But I'm sorry, I was thinking of accounting fraud. accounting fraud where things like where they're lying about how their profits or their income or expenses or what have you, where there's something or other where like you move some money from one place to another, but you should be able to cover that back, and then it won't nothing bad will happen. And in cases where, it usually starts off with some sort of case where this is actually fairly defensible, that like basically nothing bad happened, it's just you're supposed to report these things in a very complex way, and the person didn't report it in the complex way because they got lazy and didn't do the work. So they weren't, at first, doing anything that was actually unethical in their accounting. They weren't lying to people about the reality of the situation. They were just failing to follow some complicated way of doing things, like, when stuff crosses thresholds of calendar thresholds, things like this, where now you're supposed to report this is a loss and this is a profit or stuff. There are various things like this where life gets really complex, even though nothing actually different has happened, simply because of some arbitrary borders that got crossed in terms of like time or what have you. They cheat there where they're not harming anyone because everything's still on the up and up, except they're not really following the rules they technically should. But then they realize, in thinking about it, like, wow, I just did this thing that, like, actually would be wrong, even though there's no underlying morality to it. And I got away with it. And, like, then they get tempted to do it again. And they remember that they got away with it and this will work. And what happens is they stretch it a bit. And then at some point, what they start doing is figuring, like, well, I'm already lying about, I've got some bigger problem. This one I can't fix easily. This is a real problem. And then they think to themselves, well, I've already been lying about stuff in the past. I'll just, okay, this one's an outright lie. This one I'm genuinely lying about us having had income that we simply didn't have ever. But it's because there's this, and then you get the rationalization, often something like, it's an unusual event and the shareholders will punish us. So if we just smooth this out, then we'll borrow it against, revenues from the future and everything will work its way out. And then, of course, it often doesn't, in which case the people get, eventually, then they tell lies to cover the lies, and eventually it gets really big, and then they get caught. But in terms of how did they get to that point where they are lying to people about hundreds of millions of dollars of income or, things of this nature, I'm willing to bet, I didn't look into the history of this, but I'm willing to bet that scandal with Volkswagen where they had the computer faking the emissions testing, that probably was not the very first time they went wrong. They probably went wrong some other time before then where they did something that was a lot, with a lot more wiggle room, where technically speaking, the thing that they did was they weren't testing whether or not they were in testing. It was just some differing mode they had to deal with different driving conditions happened to benefit testing. And then they noticed, and it's like, ooh, should we tell that the testing people that their tests were not completely representative? Whatever. At which point now you've got that precedent of, well, we already had something that kind of cheated on the testing in a sense, even though we didn't mean it to be cheating. Again, I'm speculating there, but if it didn't happen there, it's happened in plenty of other places. And this is how people often get into this sort of trouble. So there's sort of two takeaways from this on the personal level. There's the, how did this happen? Well, for most things like this, how did a person get to the point of doing X? There's a very good chance it's along a progression like this. Taking this on the personal level, there are two things about recognizing progressions like this. One of them is towing the line in that old sense, TOE, putting your toes up against the line but not crossing over it, is a bad idea because it's really easy to lose your balance. It is a terrible idea to toe the line. I mean, granted, the original was from like the idea of like, don't cross this line, and the person walks right up to it and doesn't cross, and it's like, yeah, what are you going to do? So the original, I think, came from a certain amount of interpersonal aggression and so on. But, the metaphor of putting your toes right up against the line but not stepping over it, usually a bad idea in life. It's usually a good idea to have at least some buffer between you and actually doing something wrong. So this way, even if you screw up, you're still pretty far away and won't perform that psychological trick on yourself of, man, I'm completely lost anyway, so I might as well start shooting up the heroin and murdering people. Okay, the other thing too is simply, regardless of that, being realistic. I mean, this is kind of an important part of life in general, but it's also important to always be be realistic about yourself. To be realistic, first, how good were you to begin with, because you weren't perfect anyway. And second, what is it you actually did? Did you really actually commit yourself to something evil? Or, are you being melodramatic? Are you hoping to just get away from the struggle of wrestling with temptation, because giving in is just easier at this point? Being realistic is extremely important, will help as sort of the second safety factor. So anyway, as I said, it's one of the strange movie, because it wasn't presented in an at all believable way. It was simply, however, realistic. And there's even, I think, a life lesson in that I think a lot of us simply aren't realistic about how real life actually goes in terms of good people doing bad things. We're so afraid of that sort of state, like it's some sort of contagion, that we don't even familiarize ourselves with it in a way that enables us to stay away from it, to recognize it for what it is if it does get closer to us. So, I mean, there's, I think, just one extra lesson to draw in there, that not defending Revenge of the Sith as being well told or good story writing or presenting or so on, but nonetheless, there's, a lesson to learn about ourselves, that we shouldn't be familiar with evil in the experiential sense, but we should be familiar with it in the theoretical sense, so that we can recognize it and actually stay away from it. And I think a lot of us fail there somewhat. We're so unfamiliar with it, we leave ourselves being vulnerable, to mistakes, precisely because we don't, look at mistakes honestly to be able to recognize them if they come our way, or if, they become temptations to us. So, hope that was interesting, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.